Every execution in this country is preceded by years, sometimes decades, of procedural certainty. Forms are filed, dates are set, appeals are heard and rejected, governors are petitioned, last meal requests are submitted and granted. There is a machinery to it, and the machinery's function is not only to execute a sentence, but to generate the appearance of exhaustive deliberation, to produce the administrative record that says, "We were careful, we checked, we are sure." In September of 2005, that machinery was preparing to execute a man named Marcus Elroy Webb for the murder of a woman named Sandra Briggs, who was found strangled in her apartment in the spring of 1987. Marcus had been convicted in 1988 on the basis of eyewitness testimony from a neighbor who claimed to have seen him leave Sandra's apartment building the night of the murder. He had maintained his innocence for 18 years. He had appealed every conviction point that could be appealed. He had been denied clemency twice. His execution date had been set for November 15th, 2005. On October 19th, 2005, 27 days before the execution, a prison guard at the state penitentiary submitted an unusual report to his supervisor. The report described a conversation the guard had overheard in the prison yard between two inmates who had been housed in the same unit for 3 years. One of the inmates was telling the other, in what the guard described as a confessional tone, the specific details of a murder he had committed in 1987. And the details he provided, details that had never been made public, that were contained only in the sealed evidence file of Sandra Briggs' murder case, were accurate, down to the color of the furniture, down to the particular object that had been used as a ligature, down to a detail about a photograph on Sandra's nightstand that had never appeared in any news coverage of the case. The inmate was not Marcus Webb. The inmate was a man named Gerald Poole, who had been serving a 20-year sentence for an unrelated crime and who was scheduled for parole review in 18 months. He had apparently decided that if he was getting out regardless, there was something he needed to say out loud before he left the place where he had served his sentence alongside the man who was in prison for a murder he had committed. This is the story of what happened next and what had happened before, and why Marcus Webb spent 18 years in a cell he never should have been in. Sandra Briggs was 29 years old when she was killed. She was a graphic designer who had moved to the city 2 years earlier for a job at an advertising agency. She was, by the accounts of her colleagues and friends, cheerful, well-liked, and in the process of building a life with the deliberate enthusiasm of a person who had left a smaller town behind and was grateful to have made it somewhere bigger. She had an apartment she was proud of. She had a cat. She had a small circle of friends she met for dinner on Thursday evenings. On the night of March 21st, 1987, Sandra Briggs was strangled in her apartment. Her body was discovered the following morning when she did not appear at a work meeting, and a colleague went to check on her. The investigation was conducted by a detective named Carl Hewitt, a 16-year veteran of the city's homicide unit, who, by the time of Sandra's murder, was known in the department as thorough but under pressure. His caseload was heavy. He had recently received an unsatisfactory performance review related to the pace of his case clearances. He was, colleagues would later say in retrospect, a detective who needed this case to close. The primary evidence in the original investigation was the eyewitness testimony of a man named Leonard Price. who lived in the apartment directly below Sandra's. Leonard Price told investigators he had seen a black man in his late 20s leaving Sandra's apartment building at approximately 10:30 p.m. on the night of the murder. He described the man as wearing a dark jacket and carrying a small bag. He said he recognized the man as someone he had seen in the building before. Marcus Webb, nearly 24 years old at the time, lived 3 blocks away from Sandra's building. He had no criminal history. He worked as a warehouse stocker and attended community college part-time. He acknowledged to investigators, visited Sandra's building several times. He had a friend who lived there on the 2nd floor. He had never met Sandra Briggs and had no connection to her. He could not, when investigators asked, account specifically for his whereabouts between 9 p.m. and midnight on March 21st. He said he had been home alone. He had no alibi. Detective Hewitt showed Leonard Price a photo array. The array included Marcus Webb's photograph and 5 other men of similar general description. Leonard Price selected Marcus Webb. He said he was pretty sure, those were the words recorded in the investigative file, pretty sure, that Marcus was the man he had seen. On the strength of that identification and the absence of an alibi, Marcus Webb was arrested, charged, and tried for the first-degree murder of Sandra Briggs. He was convicted in December of 1988 by a jury that deliberated for 9 hours. He was sentenced to death. He was 25 years old. Marcus Webb entered death row at the age of 25 and did not leave it for 18 years. Except for court appearances. He maintained from day one, in his trial testimony, in his initial post-conviction appeals, in every interview, in every letter to his family and to attorneys and to anyone he could reach, that he had not killed Sandra Briggs. He had never met Sandra Briggs. He had no motive to harm Sandra Briggs. The eyewitness had been wrong. The post-conviction legal process in death penalty cases is, in theory, designed to provide exhaustive review. In practice, it is designed around an assumption of correctness, the assumption that the jury got it right, and the burden on the defendant to overturn that assumption is extraordinary. Marcus filed 12 separate appeals over 18 years. 7 were rejected on procedural grounds. 4 were rejected on the merits. 1. A petition arguing that the photo array procedure used by Detective Hewitt was impermissibly suggestive came close. The federal appeals court that heard that petition rejected it in a 2-1 decision, with a dissenting judge who wrote a 30-page opinion arguing that the identification procedure was so flawed as to be constitutionally unreliable. That dissent would later be cited extensively in the litigation that followed Marcus Webb's exoneration. It was written in 2001 and had no immediate practical effect, but it went into the record, and records matter when someone eventually decides to look. Marcus Webb's mother, Celeste Webb, spent 18 years doing everything a family member in her position could do. She wrote to the Innocence Project. She was told on 2 separate occasions that the case lacked the biological evidence needed to pursue DNA testing. The murder had produced physical evidence, but nothing that had been definitively linked to a specific suspect. She wrote to journalists. She wrote to the governor twice. She kept every document, every letter, every court filing in a filing cabinet in her dining room that she referred to, without irony, as the Cabinet of Hope. She had a heart attack in 2003 and was back at her dining room table with the files within 2 weeks of leaving the hospital. Gerald Poole entered the state penitentiary in 1998 on a conviction for armed robbery with serious bodily harm. He was sentenced to 22 years. He was not, by institutional records, a notable prisoner. He followed the rules. He participated in vocational training. He worked in the prison's kitchen. He was, by the accounts of guards who interacted with him regularly, quiet. Not the quiet of a man processing something, they said. Just quiet. What was happening inside Gerald Poole's head over those years, and specifically what prompted the confession in October 2005, is something that criminologists and psychologists who have reviewed the case have speculated about extensively. The most compelling theory, advanced by a forensic psychologist who testified in the subsequent proceedings, is that Poole's approaching parole date created what she called a horizon anxiety. The prospect of leaving the contained world of the prison and re-entering a world in which Sandra Briggs' murder was an open wound, an untreated thing, something that would have to be lived with in freedom rather than buried in routine, caused him psychological distress significant enough to overcome his self-preservation instinct. The detail that he apparently knew the real killer was serving time in the same institution for an unrelated crime has struck many observers as an almost unbearable coincidence. It was not a coincidence. When investigators later reconstructed Poole's knowledge of Marcus Webb's case, they found evidence that Poole had, from the early 2000s onward, been quietly tracking Marcus Webb's legal battles through newspaper coverage. He knew the execution date. He knew the appeals had been exhausted. He had, a prison counselor later recalled, asked the counselor in the summer of 2005 what happened to a death row inmate's case if new evidence came to light less than a month before an execution. And the counselor had answered the question as a hypothetical and had not given it further thought until October of 2005. The conversation the prison guard overheard in the yard on October 19th was not a spontaneous outburst. It was, in retrospect, a confession designed to be overheard. Gerald Poole had chosen his audience, his timing, and his level of detail carefully. He had provided enough specific, non-public information about Sandra Briggs' murder to be verifiable. He had provided it to a man he trusted to report it. And then, when the guards submitted the report and investigators arrived at his cell 2 days later, he made a formal, recorded confession to the murder of Sandra Briggs, providing details that could only have been known to the killer. What happened between October 19th, 2005 and November 15th? 2005, or 27 days, is one of the most extraordinary sequences of events in the recent history of wrongful conviction cases in this country. Every person involved in those 27 days was operating under a time pressure that had no parallel in normal legal procedure. A man was scheduled to die in less than a month, and the evidence that he might be innocent had just arrived. The prison guard's report reached the warden's office on October 20th. The warden, recognizing immediately what he was dealing with, contacted the state attorney general's office directly, bypassing the normal chain of investigative referral. The attorney general's office assigned a senior prosecutor named Catherine Vance, who had 7 years of experience in post-conviction review. Catherine Vance later wrote an account of those 27 days for a law review journal that is one of the most gripping pieces of legal writing I have ever read. Vance's account describes the challenge of verifying Poole's confession against the sealed evidence file, a file that hadn't been reviewed in the context of a live investigation for 17 years. The lead detective, Carl Hewitt, had retired in 1999. Accessing the file required a court order. The court order required a petition. The petition required filing on an expedited basis with a judge who was already carrying a heavy calendar. The first petition was filed on October 23rd. It was granted on October 25th. The file was unsealed on October 27th. The specific details Poole had provided in the prison yard, the color of Sandra's furniture, the object used as a ligature, the photograph on the nightstand, were all confirmed in the sealed file. On October 28th, Catherine Vance's office filed an emergency motion for a stay of execution. The motion was heard by a state superior court judge on November 1st. The stay was granted. Marcus Webb's execution, scheduled for November 15th, was suspended. Catherine Vance has said in multiple subsequent interviews that she did not sleep between October 19th and November 1st. Not properly. She kept a photograph of Sandra Briggs on her desk throughout those 12 days because she was making decisions that affected both a man on death row and the family of a murder victim, and she did not want to lose sight of either one in the procedural machinery. Once Marcus Webb's execution was stayed, and Gerald Poole's confession had been formally recorded and verified, the investigation bifurcated. One track focused on Poole, building the case for his prosecution for Sandra Briggs's murder. The other track, which would ultimately prove equally consequential, focused on why Marcus Webb had been convicted in the first place. The examination of the original investigation revealed failures that were, taken individually, defensible, and taken together, catastrophic. The photo array shown to Leonard Price had been administered by Detective Hewitt himself, a practice that was already recognized as problematic in 1988. Since an investigating detective's behavior during an identification procedure can inadvertently communicate to the witness which photograph the detective believes is the right one. The FBI and academic researchers had been documenting this problem for years before Sandra Briggs was murdered. Detective Hewitt had been trained in the old protocol. He used the old protocol. Leonard Price, re-interviewed in 2005 as a 71-year-old man, was shaken. He said that he had always felt uncertain about his identification, that pretty sure in his original statement had been a genuine qualification, not a rhetorical one, and that in the weeks after the trial, when Marcus was sentenced to death, he had been troubled. He had not come forward. He told investigators in 2005 that he had been afraid that recanting would create legal problems for him. He had told himself that the jury had heard all the evidence and had decided. He had tried to believe the system had checked the other parts he couldn't see. He had, he said, largely succeeded at not thinking about it. He had not, he also said, entirely succeeded. The forensic evidence, re-examined with 2005 technology, produced a partial DNA profile from the ligature that had not been possible to analyze in 1988. The profile excluded Marcus Webb and was consistent with Gerald Poole. This evidence, combined with Poole's confession, the verified details, and Price's re-interview, formed the basis of a joint motion by the prosecution and Marcus Webb's defense attorney to vacate the conviction. Marcus Webb's conviction was vacated on January 14, 2006. He walked out of the state penitentiary on January 17, 2006. He had been inside for 18 years 1 month and 3 days. Gerald Poole was charged with the first-degree murder of Sandra Briggs in March 2006. His confession, combined with the DNA evidence, made the trial largely a formality. He was convicted and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. He was 51 years old at the time of sentencing. His parole date, the horizon that had apparently catalyzed his confession, was no longer relevant. The Briggs family, Sandra's parents and 2 siblings, had spent 18 years believing that the man who had killed their daughter was on death row. The experience of the 5-year period from 2001, when they were first notified that the case was being reviewed, to 2006, when Poole was convicted, was one they described in victim impact statements as a second loss. The conviction of Marcus Webb had given them, in the terrible arithmetic of grief, something that felt like closure. The revelation that the conviction had been wrong required them to process not just the reopened horror of Sandra's death, but also 18 years of misdirected grief and misplaced certainty. Sandra's mother, in her victim impact statement at Poole's sentencing, said that she had forgiven the justice system for its failures a long time ago, and she did not mean it. Marcus Webb spent several years after his release in what his family and friends describe as a gradual process of re-entry that had no roadmap and no institutional support. The state where he was imprisoned provided, at the time of his exoneration, no mandatory compensation, no mental health services, and no re-entry assistance for wrongfully convicted individuals. He had been incarcerated at the age of 24 and was released at 43. He had missed his 20s and 30s. His mother, Celeste, who had maintained the Cabinet of Hope for 18 years, died in 2009, 3 years after Marcus walked out of prison. She had lived to see it. That is the one thing. Marcus Webb eventually received a civil settlement from the state that was, he has said publicly, inadequate but accepted. He has become an advocate for wrongful conviction reform and has worked with several organizations that provide legal and social support to exonerated individuals. He speaks occasionally at universities and community events. He does not speak easily about the years inside. He speaks readily about his mother. The case of Marcus Webb sits in a body of documented wrongful conviction cases that share a set of common failure points: eyewitness misidentification, inadequate investigation, reliance on a single piece of evidence, and a post-conviction system designed to resist correction rather than enable it. These are not new observations. Researchers have been documenting these failure points for decades. And the question that the Marcus Webb case forces, as it has forced in dozens of similar cases before it, is why the documentation of the problem has not produced commensurate reform. Eyewitness identification reform, and specifically the use of double-blind procedures where the officer administering the photo array does not know who the suspect is, has been adopted in some jurisdictions and resisted in others. The resistance is typically institutional, not empirical. No serious researcher in forensic psychology argues that the old procedures are reliable. The argument is about the cost and disruption of change, which is a different argument and a less defensible one. When the cost of not changing is measured in people's lives. The DNA evidence that ultimately exonerated Marcus Webb existed in the evidence file from 1988. The technology to analyze it did not. This is now a permanent feature of the post-conviction landscape. Evidence that was preserved from cases that predate modern forensic capabilities can, in some cases, be reanalyzed with current technology to produce results that were not available at the time of trial. The Innocence Project has used this principle to exonerate more than 200 people in the United States. Marcus Webb was one of them. There are others whose files sit in evidence storage rooms and have not been requested for review because no one has made the request, because the person whose name is on the file has run out of legal options, or because their family does not have the resources to pursue them. The specific element of this case that distinguishes it from many similar ones is, of course, the confession. Gerald Poole confessed. He confessed with specific, verifiable, non-public details that proved his knowledge of the crime. And he confessed 27 days before the scheduled execution of an innocent man. If the prison guard had not filed that report, if the report had sat in a supervisor's inbox for a week rather than being escalated immediately, if the Attorney General's office had not taken the referral seriously and assigned Catherine Vance rather than a less experienced prosecutor, Marcus Webb would have been executed. That proximity, 27 days, is the detail I find myself unable to move past. Not because it is the only near miss in the history of capital punishment, but because it is recent enough to be concrete. This was 2005. At the machinery of execution and the machinery of exoneration were operating simultaneously on the same man, and the outcome depended on a guard's decision to write a report, a supervisor's decision to escalate it, and an attorney general's office's decision to take it seriously. Marcus Webb was 43 years old when he walked out of prison. He had gone in at 24. He had lost his 20s and his 30s to a courtroom identification that was, by the admission of the man who made it, never more than pretty sure. He had been within 27 days of being executed for a murder committed by a man who was, at that moment, serving time in the same institution. The people who caused Marcus Webb's wrongful conviction were not, for the most part, malicious. Detective Hewitt was a tired man under pressure who used the only procedure he had been trained in. Leonard Price was a witness who expressed a genuine uncertainty that the system converted into certainty without his consent. The jurors deliberated for 9 hours and voted for a conviction based on the evidence presented to them. None of them are monsters. The outcome is monstrous anyway. This is what makes wrongful conviction cases so difficult to resolve at a systemic level. They are almost never produced by bad people with bad intentions. They are produced by systems that have design flaws that are known, that have been documented, that could be fixed, and that are not fixed because fixing them requires resources and political will and an acknowledgement that the system that generated the error was, in fact, systemically wrong. That acknowledgement is harder than it should be. Marcus Webb is alive. Sandra Briggs' family has the real verdict. Gerald Poole is in prison for the rest of his life. These are the correct outcomes. They arrived too late, at too high a cost, because too many points in the system had to function correctly in sequence for the correct outcome to be produced. That fragility, the fragility of justice in cases where the margin between life and death is 27 days, and a guard's decision to write a report, is what keeps me coming back to these cases. Because if we do not understand how the system fails, we cannot understand what it would take to make it not fail again. Thank you for watching. If you want to support the work of organizations doing wrongful conviction advocacy, the Innocence Project and the National Registry of Exonerations are linked in the description. New case every Thursday. The bell icon ensures you do not miss it.